Hey guys, today you've got a video on the respiratory system. You should have already watched one on the cardiovascular system, which is blood vessels and the heart. Respiratory system is the lungs. So there's three main terms that you need to know when it comes to breathing, first of all. And that is respiration rate, tidal volume, and ventilation. So respiration rate is, if you relate it back to the heart rate is the amount of times the heart beats each minute. Respiration rate is the amount of times that the lungs breathe each minute. So on average, you might breathe maybe about 12 times. If you were sitting there quietly and you timed yourself on breathing, you probably end up with about 12 to 13 breaths in that minute. The tidal volume is how much oxygen or how much air that you would breathe in each breath. So that's sort of measuring the capacity of your lungs. So the higher this value, the better the capacity your lungs have. But on average, your lungs should be able to breathe in and out about half a litre of air. That can possibly go up to 3 litres when you exercise, but that's in trained individuals, so elite athletes. Ventilation is a combination of respiratory rate or respiration rate and tidal volume. So all you have to do is multiply those two figures together. So you multiply tidal volume and respiratory rate, and you end up on average at rest with about 7.5 litres of air being breathed each minute. So when it comes to the anatomy of the respiratory system, there's a few new words. Actually, there's a lot of new words. So first of all, I just have to distinguish that there is a difference between where the food travels and where the air travels. So the food travels down the esophagus and that leads onto your stomach. There is a separate pipe and that's where the air travels, and that air travels down through to the lungs. So what we're talking about is the windpipe here. So first up is the air goes through the nose or the mouth and it hits the pharynx. And once it gets from the pharynx, it goes through to the larynx, which is, it houses your voice box. So if you end up with laryngitis, that's an inflammation of the larynx and you're not able to speak. So they're basically just different sections of this windpipe, as is the trachea, that's the next section down. And then what happens is it branches out into two, one for each lung. So those two branches are called bronchi, or the individual one is a bronchus. So in one lung you've got one bronchus, and that bronchus divides out into even smaller tubes, and they're called bronchioles, and they're varying sizes. They can go from quite large to quite small. The smallest ones will connect up to little air sacs or little bubbles called alveoli. Now, at a microscopic level, if you were to cut out a slide, or cut out some lung and put it on a slide and look at it under a microscope, it just sort of looks like misshaped bubbles. The alveoli actually, in 3D, they end up looking a little bit like bunches of grapes. So your lungs aren't just big sacs of air, they're not two big bags, they're actually spongy tissue, and the spongy tissue is made up of alveoli. One little air sac is called an alveolus, which we'll have a look at in the next slide. So this is an alveolus, and the sort of the caterpillar wiggly sort of thing around it is a capillary. So capillary, remember, is the smallest type of blood vessel, and it runs around the outside of the alveolus. So the reason for that being is we need to transfer gases here. So we need to get rid of the carbon dioxide because it builds up to toxic levels. We don't want that. And we also need to extract oxygen so we can send that to the working muscles. So at the top there you've got the red blood cells, and they've got some carbon dioxide with them, so they're blue, and so they drop that off and it diffuses. So the term is diffusion. It diffuses into the alveolus, and at the same time the oxygen diffuses out of the alveolus and into the bloodstream. And so the oxygen, when it attaches to the red blood cells, creates a chemical reaction, and that's why the blood turns red again. Okay, so what actually causes breathing? Well, your brain decides that, yes, I've got too much carbon dioxide, so I need to get rid of that. The need for oxygen is a lot less than the need to get rid of carbon dioxide. So if you didn't actually create carbon dioxide, you could probably hold your breath for quite a long time because you don't use all the oxygen that you breathe in. So the whole point of you breathing is to get rid of that carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is a trigger for the brain, and then the brain stimulates your breathing. So when you hold your breath for as long as you can, and then you need to either breathe out or breathe back in again, that desire actually comes from the buildup of carbon dioxide. Now, the mechanics of breathing, you've got here on the left-hand side something called a diaphragm, and that's a big sheet of muscle that sort of sits underneath the lungs. And so when you actually breathe in, your diaphragm actually contracts and pulls the lungs downwards and pulls them out into the body cavity. So your lungs are basically pulled and then draw the air inwards. So when you breathe, what's driving that is the diaphragm. When you want to exhale or breathe out, the diaphragm relaxes and it sort of lets go of the lungs, and the lungs can collapse back in again. So the reason the lungs actually expand in the first place is because the diaphragm is almost like a big suction cup and pulls them outwards in the first place and then draws all the air in. Okay, so just in summary, the pathway of the oxygen goes from the mouth or the nose to the pharynx, to the larynx, the trachea, bronchus, bronchiole, alveoli, and blood. And then you've got three particular terms there that you also need to learn, which is the respiratory rate, the tidal volume, and the ventilation. Thanks for listening.